What was it like to be a German general in 1940? You have just made the loveliest military triumphs in all modern times. Poland fell in weeks. Norway and Denmark were neutralized fast. The Low Countries were ruined within a few days. And above all, France, the great power of Europe, fell off the earth in half a dozen weeks. Great Britain should have followed by all the rules of war, strategy, and political logic. The escape at Dunkirk left Britain wounded, isolated, and armed with no weapons. All the tactical calculations were leading to a certain British capitulation. But during 2 bloody years, between the fall of France in mid-1940 and the origin of the reversal in late 1942, Britain was engaged in a struggle entirely on her own. This very obstinate denial of defeat caused no little irritation to the German High Command, but actually astonishment and bewilderment. They had hoped that the British would crumble fast, but instead they were witnessing a nation that completely declined to be the defeated. This video is a narrative of the 2 desolate years where the German generals were in high rank, and what they actually felt when approached and told that Britain would not surrender. The atmosphere of German headquarters in June 1940 and until June 22, 1941, was that of complete, absolute confidence. The army, the Wehrmacht, was unstoppable, and the main military principle, the Blitzkrieg, was impeccable. They had swept Europe in a successive of short, sharp, decisive maneuver. To the German General Staff, war was an exercise in efficiency. This was done to bring the enemy to a political breakdown before the army could be fully organized or a prolonged war of attrition could be initiated, a war that the German traditionally dreaded. June 22, 1941, was the day when German commanders observed their armies initiate the greatest invasion in history to attack the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa. They thought that, like France, the Soviet Union would not last a few more weeks, and that Britain, having no longer a prospect of an East ally, would then at last be forced to submit to peace. Their armies had thus far suppressed all opposition, and their political and military reason seemed at that period to be impeccable. In the opinion of the Germans, British actions following the collapse of France did not make sense at all. The exodus at Dunkirk, though celebrated as a moral victory, was a military catastrophe. With one blow, Britain lost the greater part of her heavy equipment. More than 70,000 vehicles, 2,500 heavy guns, 400,000 tons of supplies had been left on the beaches. Britain was made powerless on the land. The fact that they probably had to confront a full-fledged German army using minimal weapons and troops appeared suicidal. But Winston Churchill, as Prime Minister, would not even listen to terms. He never gave hope founded upon material might. He gave them a moral certitude which Germany was incapable of comprehending. All he gave the British people was blood, toil, tears, and sweat, and a battle to the very end. German intelligence men, who were trained to believe that political will was the next thing to the military reality, reread his speeches and strived to discover some enigma that Britain was willing to bargain, a political get-out clause, a backdoor compromise. There was nothing. The message of Churchill was absolute and without any compromise. Within Berlin, the top leadership felt that Churchill could only be ousted by political common sense. They hoped that some less fanatic British politician would intervene and take the reality of German supremacy and establish peace when France collapsed. This opinion was supported at the very beginning. Hitler even delivered a speech, publicly on July 19, 1940, in the Reichstag, and presented it as a magnanimous opportunity to Britain to withdraw the war, believing that such a highly visible act would take London towards negotiations. He felt that he was offering the British people an escape out of the hands of the warmonger Churchill. When Britain responded by saying her answer was negative, in one sentence, in the newspapers, and by an open declaration of refusal to discuss matters, German leaders were truly shocked. They had not at all understood what British democracy was like, and the very national determination that the menace of invasion had in a moment created and welded together. In his frustration, General Franz Halder, who was the chief of the Army General Staff at the time, recorded how the hopelessness of their position could not be understood by the British. The German generals were perfected in the calculus of military forces, improvised in the calculus of national will. As soon as the fact that Britain would not make any concessions settled in, Germany began to consider an attack across the English Channel seriously, Operation Sea Lion. This was at once dealt a strong dose of naval reality. Experts at the naval side said that this would be an epic undertaking and one that demanded enormous numbers of ships and landing vessels, and it was only possible when the German Air Force eliminated the Royal Air Force and controlled the skies first. The German Navy, Kriegsmarine, was in no way ready. Their professionals said that they needed to gain air superiority at least 14 consecutive days before the first wave could be landed. On paper, the invasion scheme required hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of ships to pass through a small area of water, which in reality was under the hot pursuit of the Royal Navy. The impossible logistical challenge was stressed by the German solution, which consisted of using converted river barges as transportation means. Even the Royal Navy destroyers would have destroyed the whole invasion force before it hit the beach. Hermann Göring, a leader of the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, was blinded by the egocentrism and previous success. He assured Hitler that he could remove the problem of Britain through the air, and he considered the issue to be simply a question of efficiency. He thought that after a few weeks of vigorous offensive, he could eliminate the air defenses of the British on the south of England and open the way to invasion. The Air Force had overpowered the foes in Poland and France, where the defenders quickly deserted the skies. The German generals believed these promises, and high ranks, such as the Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, told his fellow generals that they were sure to defeat Britain through the air. They figured that the RAF was on the brink of collapsing. This was based on a crippling intelligence failure because they misjudged two crucial British strengths of which they themselves were poorly informed: radar and production. On August 13, 1940, Germany launched a great air campaign, named officially Adlertag, Eagle Day. The first attacks were carried out on airfields, radar stations, and ports of the Fighter Command of the RAF. Destruction of the RAF by the Germans was supposed to come fast, but this was not the case, as the initial results turned out. The losses of the Germans were always greater than it was hoped, and the strength of the British fighters did not fall. German men in the air and in command positions continued to witness British combatants re-emerging over and over again, when they were sure that the specific bases must have been destroyed. The secret was the Dowding system, the combined ground integrated interception system, the brainchild of Sir Hugh Dowding. The RAF was given enough time to prepare, thanks to the radar chain home in Britain. The command and control system made sure that the RAF never ever deployed all its forces simultaneously, so that, in case of damages to any squadron, one could easily repair and replace it. This provided German pilots with the illusion day after day that they had engaged in the previous day battle only to encounter fresh and prepared opposition the next morning. Britain had, behind the scenes, transformed aircraft production into a desperate national effort which was led by the Ministry of Aircraft Production, led by Lord Beaverbrook. Within short periods, factories would mend damaged men and construct others in unimaginable numbers, which was grossly underestimated by German intelligence. More importantly, the British were out-manufacturing the Germans in the fighter aircraft at this critical period. In addition, even the fighter pilots themselves were a secret strength. Occupied countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia supplied pilots to the RAF with amazing prowess and ruthless motivation. An example of this is the Polish 303 Squadron that was made one of the most effective squadrons in the fight. This and obstinate, seemingly tireless air defense was inexplicable indeed to German observers in the terms of their previous understanding of a decadent Britain. German command was frustrated that the airfields were not being destroyed enough, and it resulted in a catastrophic error. They began attacking the cities of Britain, and the first was London bombed on September 7, 1940. This move was referred to as the Blitz. German leadership thought that killing of civilians, burning down of homes, and causing nightly terror would eventually demoralize the British and make the government to negotiate peace. They had already managed to intimidate Warschau and Rotterdam civilians. They anticipated riots and panic. Rather, the opposite of this took place. This gargantuan strategic blunder allowed the vital fighter bases of the RAF the much-needed breathing space to saviour. There was reconstruction of airfields, also reorganization of units, and introduction of fresh pilots into the battle. In the meantime, once the first shock was over, British civilians did not panic, but turned into a cohesive outburst and a greater desire to continue the resistance, which is the so-called Blitz spirit. By moving to cities, the Luftwaffe essentially ensured defeat of the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain. German planes now had a wider range, consumed more fuel, and were easier to hit. During the major engagements of the middle of September, German groups were exposed to the assault of British forces en masse, and their own operational intelligence had indicated that the RAF would be fully operational. On September 17, 1940, Hitler put off the invasion of Britain quietly but decisively. The Operation Sea Lion was officially postponed indefinitely, and the plan was forgotten. In the first instance in the war, Germany had not achieved a key strategic target. The cargo ships to be used in the invasion were returned to ordinary service, and the scheme of crossing the Channel was more a dream than a project. Bombing British cities went on and on through many months, but it was largely destruction in and of itself, no longer allied to an invasion strategy which was realistic and attainable. A myth about the invincible Wehrmacht had been completely damaged. The defeat of France brought so much doubt in the German high command. So far, the generals had been acting on the plans of Hitler with close to 100% confidence. The Battle of Britain was the first occasion that they had to engage in a battle with no clear and attainable goal, which caused confusion in their strategies and lack of trust in what Göring had promised. The main operational planner, General Erich von Manstein, said that there was the increasing panic that Hitler was now willing to engage in a long attrition conflict, which was precisely the kind of war that Germany was designed in no way to execute. And worst of all, there was the threat of a two-front war which might be emerging. The German High Command was starting to understand that Hitler was making wishes and not plans which were military in nature. As long as Britain was still there, and invasion was categorically out of the question, the German High Command now reverted to the long-term ideological ambition of Hitler to conquer the Soviet Union. They thought that they can destroy the Soviets, grab all their oil and grain wealth, and make Germany so strong so that Britain will be compelled to take peace eventually, because they would have no other option than having a strong potential ally in the future. This invasion, Operation Barbarossa, was not a war on its own, but the next desperate effort to coerce Britain to capitulate. What they had not really comprehended was that they were just to go against another adversary that would continue to fight much longer, as long indeed as German planners believed, more irrationally and militarily than wise. They have exchanged the logistical challenge of making the crossings of the English Channel with the boundless bath of chaos of the Russian steppes. German generals interviewed after the war, and in trials by Allied historians, showed markedly the same consistent pattern in their remarks regarding Britain. They admired British spirits and did not think British equipments or numbers better. What shocked them, and which they could never reason out, was the fact that Britain would not admit defeat so plainly. General Gunther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff, Army Group D, said simply, "The British people were just incomprehensible through their tenacity and their refusal to admit defeat." He wrote that they had heard Britain was weak and decadent, but the manner in which the British fought showed those cultural beliefs to be fatally misguided. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, head of OKW, confessed that they had grossly underestimated Churchill and the will of the British nation. General Alfred Jodl lamented that the British just could not accept that they were defeated, and even many years after, he could not comprehend this psychological phenomenon that had no military and political sense. It was merely a formula with willpower prevailing over material strength to the German generals. They were able to enumerate the aircraft, the ships, and the tanks. However, they completely miscalculated the soul of a nation that was in rebellion. They were ready to have a military conflict. They were facing a moral one. The 2 years of solitude of the fighting of Britain was not merely an act of obstinacy, it was a move of monumental success. They purchased the time which was absolutely necessary to change the balance of power. At the end of 1942, the broader war was eventually beginning to swing. Churchill could inform British people that even though victory was still distant, the start of struggle was over. Britain had survived air attack, had spent 2 years alone, and remained in the battle long enough that the economy of the United States had mobilized, and that the Soviet Union had survived the first German attack. Without Britain falling in 1940, the war would have been over. Rather, Britain was the anchor, the inertial, immobile foundation upon which everyone would ultimately mount a counterattack by the Allies. Britain should have not made it through those initial years alone, in mere material and military terms. It had fewer forces, its cities were weak, and its strategic position was very hazardous. However, the role that the German leadership had enacted Britain, it decided to refuse to lose, and instead, it clung on until it was helped. The German military science was genius in logistics, speed, and maneuver. Military science is, however, commonly a statistical estimation. Force A versus Force B. What the German generals could not consider was the variable that could not be quantified, the human element. They had made war a question of mathematics and had lost sight of the fact that history is often passion-loving and pride-asserting. Britain was a small fraction, which could not be rounded to the zero. The narration of the British struggling single-handedly 2 years, and the amazement this aroused in German generals, indicates that raw figures and brilliant theories are not all. In other cases, the winning side is merely the one that is unwilling to accept defeat, even when all the professionals are saying so. When you are batting alone, when you've started something that people just don't believe in, or you are simply going through a rough time, this story is a reassurance that sometimes staying in the game when it feels like the only way to survive can be the difference between success and failure. Keep in mind, the generals who calculated each plane but never had to calculate resolve. In case this glance into a pivotal scene of the World War II talked to you, then subscribe for more videos on what might have happened and happened differently in history. And when you think that determination will disturb even the most perfect calculations, give the like button a tap and forward this to a person that should be reminded to do so today.